The grand marble steps of the Jefferson City Museum gleamed under the soft winter sunlight. Inside, the cavernous lobby was already filling with the quiet shuffle of shoes and the murmur of early visitors. High ceilings arched above polished stone floors, the air tinged with the faint smell of aged paper and polished wood from the nearby archives. Dr. Elijah Bennett adjusted the strap of his worn leather satchel as he stepped inside. At 45, he carried himself with the calm dignity of someone who had spent years buried in research libraries and dusty archives. His neatly pressed charcoal coat and the wool scarf around his neck hinted at his respect for the day's importance. After all, the museum was unveiling a long anticipated exhibit on African American pioneers in the state's history. The very exhibit based on his life's work. Elijah had spent more than a decade poring over letters, legal records, and personal diaries to produce his groundbreaking book, Shadows into Light: Unsung Heroes of Our State. The book had become the foundation for the museum's new centerpiece exhibit, something he had agreed to consult on, though he had deliberately kept his visit today unannounced, hoping to experience it as any regular guest might. The lobby bustled. A school group gathered near the ticket counter, their teacher distributing wristbands. A young couple stood near the information desk, studying the floor map. In the far corner, a temporary sign pointed toward the new exhibit, From Shadows into Light: The Untold Stories of Our State's African American Founders. Elijah took a step in that direction, but before he could make it to the entrance, a voice cut through the low hum of the crowd. "Excuse me, sir." He turned. A tall, uniformed security guard with a stern expression was striding toward him. The guard's eyes flicked to Elijah's satchel, then to his face. "The exhibit's not open for general visitors yet. It's for special tours only this morning." Elijah glanced toward the hallway. "I understand. I was hoping to—" The guard interrupted, his tone tightening. "Do you have an invitation? A press pass? Something to show you're supposed to be here?" A faint ripple of attention moved through the nearby crowd. Elijah felt the weight of a few curious stares. He opened his satchel, pulling out his well-worn notebook. "I'm actually here to—" "Sir," the guard said, his voice hardening, "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. We have protocols." Elijah closed his mouth, choosing to stay calm. He'd faced moments like this before, moments where assumptions walked into the room before he did. Still, he could feel the sting of it, the sharp contrast between the pride he'd felt walking up the steps and the quiet humiliation now prickling at the edges of his composure. He stepped aside, the museum's polished floor cold under his shoes. Somewhere beyond that hallway, his research, his words, waited on display. But at that moment, he stood at the threshold, barred from entering. And the guard had no idea who he was speaking to. Elijah stood quietly for a moment, gathering himself. He wasn't a man prone to outbursts. Years of academic conferences and delicate interviews with families guarding century-old documents had taught him patience. But there was a point where patience turned into erasure, and he could feel that line brushing against his heels. He stepped back toward the guard. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Elijah began, his tone steady. The guard crossed his arms, the radio on his shoulder crackling faintly. "Rules are rules. This is a restricted preview. Without clearance, I can't let you in." Elijah reached into his satchel and pulled out a slim hardcover book. The jacket was slightly worn at the edges, its gold-embossed title catching the overhead light. Shadows into Light: Unsung Heroes of Our State. "I'm familiar with the rules," Elijah said evenly, "but I have a very particular reason for being here. You see, this," he held up the book, "is the foundation of that exhibit." The guard barely glanced at it. "We get a lot of people trying to sneak a look early. I can't just take your word for it." Something in the man's dismissive tone sent a pulse of heat through Elijah's chest. It wasn't just disbelief. It was the unspoken assumption that this man, in this skin, couldn't possibly be the scholar behind something so prestigious. "Perhaps you should call your curator," Elijah suggested, his voice sharpening slightly. "Dr. Elaine Grant will vouch for me." The guard's expression didn't change. "The curator's busy preparing for the opening ceremony. She's not taking interruptions." Elijah exhaled slowly through his nose, willing himself to stay composed. He looked past the guard, catching sight of the exhibit's entrance, a broad archway adorned with a mural of sepia-toned photographs, each face a thread in the tapestry of history he had spent years stitching together. From the corner of his eye, Elijah noticed a few visitors lingering nearby, sensing tension in the air. Their hushed murmurs were like the low rustle of leaves before a storm. "This isn't about protocol, is it?" Elijah asked quietly, his gaze fixed on the guard. The guard's jaw tightened. "I'm enforcing the rules for everyone. Now, sir, if you don't step away from the entrance, I'll have to escort you out." The words landed with a cold finality. Elijah felt a deep, familiar ache, the bitter mix of pride and hurt that came from being told, yet again, that he didn't belong in a space he had every right to enter. He closed the book and slid it back into his satchel. "Now, very well," he said calmly, though his voice carried a weight that made the guard's eyes flicker, just for a second. As Elijah stepped back toward the lobby, he knew one thing. This moment would not end here. The truth had a way of forcing its way to the surface, and when it did, it often made a fool of those who tried to suppress it. Elijah was just about to turn fully away from the exhibit entrance when a voice called out from near the lobby information desk. "Wait, did you say Dr. Bennett?" Heads turned. A woman in her early 30s, wearing a museum staff badge on a lanyard, hurried over. She had a stack of brochures in one arm and a slightly winded look, as if she'd been rushing between tasks. Her name tag read, Rebecca, Education Coordinator. "Yes," Elijah replied, his tone still measured but laced with surprise. Rebecca's eyes widened. "Oh my gosh, I recognize you from the author photo in your book. We've been using shadows into light in our student programs for months." She turned sharply toward the guard. "This is Dr. Bennett, the Dr. Bennett. The entire exhibit is based on his work." The guard's posture stiffened. His earlier confidence faltered, though he tried to mask it with a brusque reply. "He said he didn't have an invitation." "He doesn't need one," Rebecca said firmly, her voice rising just enough for a few nearby visitors to hear. "He's the reason this exhibit exists. Without his research, there would be no From Shadows into Light to preview today." A small ripple of murmurs passed through the growing crowd. People were looking at Elijah differently now, with curiosity, even respect. Rebecca turned back to Elijah. "Dr. Grant, the curator, has been talking about you all week. She wanted to introduce you at the ceremony, but she didn't think you'd be here this early." Elijah gave a faint, wry smile. "I wanted to see it the way the public would. Apparently, I misjudged the reception." Rebecca's cheeks flushed with indignation on his behalf. "Come with me. I'll take you in myself." The guard shifted uncomfortably but stepped aside, avoiding Elijah's gaze as they passed. The tension in his jaw betrayed the first crack in his authority. As Elijah followed Rebecca through the archway, he caught sight of the first display case, a glass panel etched with the opening paragraph of his book, the words he had labored over late into countless nights. Seeing them there, larger than life, should have been a moment of pure pride. Instead, the memory of being stopped, barred from the very history he had brought to light, clung to him like a shadow, and something told him that this wasn't the last time the guard would have to face that shadow. The air inside the exhibit hall was cooler, quieter, almost reverent. Soft track lighting illuminated displays arranged in a winding path, each section dedicated to a different chapter of the state's African-American history. Glass cases held delicate artifacts, hand-sewn quilts, weathered photographs, yellowed letters whose ink had faded but not vanished. Rebecca slowed her pace so Elijah could take it in. "We tried to honor every detail you included in the book," she said softly. "Even the arrangement of the timeline follows your research notes." Elijah stepped closer to a large wall display featuring a blown-up photograph of a 19th century black community meeting in front of a wooden church. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Image courtesy of Dr. Elijah Bennett's private collection." He felt a swell of pride, tempered by something more bittersweet. It was strange to see his name on the walls, while remembering that just 10 minutes earlier, a uniformed employee of this very institution had treated him like an intruder. As they moved deeper into the exhibit, Elijah stopped before a central installation, a circular room with floor-to-ceiling panels. Each panel featured a portrait and story of a historical figure he had unearthed from obscurity: abolitionists, entrepreneurs, educators. In the center, a touchscreen allowed visitors to explore digitized versions of original documents. A small crowd had gathered there. A man in his 60s, holding the exhibit guide, was reading aloud to his granddaughter. Dr. Elijah Bennett, historian and author, dedicated over 10 years to documenting these hidden stories. The little girl's eyes widened. He sounds important. Rebecca grinned and gestured toward Elijah. Sweetheart, he's standing right behind you. The man turned, blinking in surprise. You're Dr. Bennett? I am, Elijah said with a polite smile. Thank you, the man said earnestly. My family's from one of the towns you wrote about. I never knew half of this history until now. Elijah nodded, moved more than he expected. That means a great deal to me. Behind them, near the archway, the security guard had drifted just inside the exhibit. His earlier sternness was gone, replaced by a visible unease. His eyes followed Elijah as if each display, each mention of the historian's name, tightened a knot in his stomach. Elijah met the guard's gaze for the first time since passing him. He didn't hold it long, but the brief exchange was enough. The guard looked away. Rebecca leaned closer to Elijah. Dr. Grant should be here any minute. She'll want to introduce you to the board before the ribbon cutting. Elijah simply nodded, his mind turning over the strange duality of the moment. Being celebrated by strangers, while nearly being cast out by someone entrusted to protect this space. And he wondered just how the guard would react when the entire museum publicly recognized who he really was. By the time Dr. Elaine Grant arrived, the exhibit hall was buzzing. A ribbon of deep crimson stretched across the entrance, flanked by velvet ropes. Photographers adjusted their lenses, while members of the museum's board gathered near the front row of folding chairs set up for the speeches. Elijah stood off to one side with Rebecca, content to watch the preparations. He had never sought the spotlight. His work had always been about shining light on others. But today, whether he wanted it or not, that spotlight was turning toward him. Dr. Grant spotted him almost instantly. She was a tall woman in her early 50s, wearing a tailored navy suit and an expression of unshakable authority. Dr. Bennett, she exclaimed, striding over with arms open. You didn't tell me you were coming early. I would have arranged a proper welcome. I wanted to experience the exhibit as any visitor would, Elijah replied with a faint smile. Though the reception wasn't quite what I expected. Grant's brows knit in mild confusion. But before Elijah could elaborate, a museum board member tapped the microphone, calling the crowd to order. Ladies and gentlemen, the announcer began, today we open an exhibit unlike any we have ever hosted before. One that tells the untold stories of African American pioneers who shaped our state. He gestured toward the archway, where the guard from earlier now stood among other staff, his arms clasped in front of him. His expression was impassive, but his eyes flickered toward Elijah every few seconds, as if bracing for impact. This exhibit, the speaker continued, would not exist without the tireless research and vision of one man. His groundbreaking book, Shadows into Light, served as the foundation for every display you will see here today. There was a pause, a deliberate build. Please join me in welcoming the author and historian himself, Dr. Elijah Bennett. Applause erupted. Elijah stepped forward, the sound swelling around him like a wave. Cameras clicked, and a few guests even rose to their feet. From his vantage point at the entrance, the guard's composure cracked. His eyes widened, and a visible flush crept up his neck as recognition finally collided with the memory of their earlier exchange. He shifted his weight, suddenly seeming much smaller than the uniform suggested. Dr. Grant took the microphone and added, Doctor, Bennett's work has not only preserved history, but inspired generations. We are honored he is here today to cut the ribbon with us. Elijah accepted the ceremonial scissors, their polished silver reflecting the bright lights. As he turned toward the ribbon, he caught the guard's gaze once more. This time, Elijah didn't look away. He held the man's eyes, not with malice, but with a calm certainty that made the guard's jaw tighten before he dropped his stare to the floor. The ribbon parted cleanly under the blades, and the crowd cheered. Inside, the celebration had begun. But for one man standing silently by the entrance, it was the start of something else entirely. The realization of how quickly judgment could turn to humiliation when truth stepped into the room. The crowd slowly filtered into the exhibit, weaving through the displays with programs in hand. Laughter and lively conversation filled the air, blending with the soft background music the museum had chosen for the event. Elijah found himself surrounded by people wanting to shake his hand, ask questions, or share personal stories connected to his research. It was only when the initial rush subsided that he noticed the security guard lingering at the edge of the room. The man was out of place among the clusters of smiling guests, his posture stiff, hands clasped behind his back, in a show of formality that couldn't mask the tension in his shoulders. When their eyes met, the guard took a step forward, then hesitated, as if unsure whether he was welcome. Finally, he approached, his voice low enough to be heard only by Elijah. "Dr. Bennett, he swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. "I owe you an apology." Elijah didn't respond immediately. He studied the man's face, the discomfort, the embarrassment, the defensive flicker that still lingered in his eyes. For what exactly? The guard shifted his weight. For not listening. For making assumptions. "I didn't realize who you were." Elijah's tone stayed even. "And if I hadn't been who I was, would you still have treated me the same way?" The question landed like a stone in still water. The guard's jaw tightened. He looked away for a moment, as though the answer was one he wasn't ready to face aloud. "I'm sorry," he repeated finally. "It won't happen again." Elijah gave a slow nod. "I appreciate the apology, but this isn't about me. It's about how you see the people who walk through these doors. Anyone could be carrying a story worth hearing. History isn't just behind glass cases. Sometimes it's standing right in front of you." For a moment, neither man spoke. The murmur of the exhibit filled the silence. The guard gave a brief nod, his expression subdued. "I'll remember that." Elijah regarded him for another heartbeat, then turned back toward a display where a group of children were gathered, pointing excitedly at one of the interactive screens. He walked away, leaving the guard standing among the exhibits, surrounded by history, and perhaps finally ready to recognize it in more than just the artifacts. The afternoon sun was dipping low when Elijah finally stepped back out onto the museum's front steps. The marble glowed in warm amber light, and the hum of traffic blended with the distant sound of church bells somewhere downtown. He paused at the top of the stairs, letting the cool air wash over him. Inside, the ribbon-cutting ceremony had given way to guided tours and photo opportunities. The board had expressed their gratitude, Doctor. Grant had promised a commemorative plaque in his honor, and several visitors had asked for signed copies of his book. Yet, for Elijah, the day's most important moment hadn't been the public recognition. It had been the quiet exchange with the guard, the moment where an unspoken truth surfaced between them. He adjusted the strap of his satchel, feeling the weight of the book inside. To most, it was just pages and ink. To him, it was years of chasing leads through dusty courthouse basements, of earning the trust of families who had never told their stories to anyone before, of standing in the ruins of buildings long abandoned and imagining the lives once lived within their walls. At the bottom of the steps, Rebecca was waiting, holding a paper cup of coffee. "Heading out?" she asked. "For now," Elijah said with a small smile, "but I'll be back. There's always more history to uncover." She grinned. "We'll be ready for you, and I think the staff will be too." They both knew the weight of those words. Elijah turned toward the street, his footsteps steady on the sidewalk. As he walked away, the museum stood behind him, its grand facade a monument to history, but also a reminder that history wasn't just what we preserved in exhibits. It was what we chose to see or ignore in the people beside us. And maybe, just maybe, today had opened one more set of eyes.